Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the USC USED webinar series for individuals with disabilities and parents. Today's webinar is on mental health services in schools for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Today is January 26, 2017. And we are joined by an amazing 600 people with disabilities, family members, and professionals from all over the state of California, as well as 21 other states, Alaska, and of course California, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Washington, Wyoming, and even some folks from Canada. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Susan Kanagawa. I will be your moderator and host again today. I am the Family Support Coordinator at the USC University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. Today's webinar is the 23rd in a series of webinars that we started in 2015 and are continuing on this year. We plan one presentation per month, so I hope you'll be able to join us for future webinars as well, because we do have a great lineup of topics. Before we get started, I'd like to review the logistics for our webinar today. Our speaker will be covering lots of information that might be new to many of us, so I encourage you to take notes so you can review the material later. At the bottom of your screen, there's a meeting temperature slider, and this is how it works. We'll ask you just a couple of questions during the webinar, and ask that you indicate your response by moving the slider, the little circle at the bottom. The computer records the answers from the group to give us presenters a general idea of how we're doing. Also, there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our speaker, Nishanti Kurikula Surya. Please type your questions at any time during the webinar using the Ask a Question button on the top left of your screen, and we'll answer as many questions as possible after the presentation's over. And it will help us if you identify yourself as a person with a disability, a family member, or a professional in your question. The webinar is scheduled to last for an hour, but we'll finish a few minutes early. And when the webinar is over, please don't close your browser, because the survey will appear on your screen as soon as it's over, and we ask that you take that time to answer the survey and help us improve. If you registered early, you should have received an email from us with the PowerPoint slides as an attachment. You can download them, print them, and share them with family, friends, and colleagues. We'll also be posting a recording of this webinar on YouTube, and we'll let you know by email as soon as that's available. And you can also share that with your community as well. So our first poll of the day is, can you hear me well? Please move the temperature slider at the bottom of your screen by clicking on the circle in the center and dragging it right or left. And I'm seeing that you all are hearing me, so that's awesome. Thank you. And our speaker, Nishanti, can you say just a few words?
Yes, hi, good morning everyone.
Can everybody hear Nishanti? Good. Okay. I think we're good. Thank you very much for your response. So again, here is our topic for the day. And our presenter, Nishanti Kurikula Surya, is a staff attorney with Mental Health Advocacy Services. Her agency provides free legal services to people with mental disabilities. Her website and her email are there, so check out the website for more information. And now it's my pleasure to turn over the microphone to Nishanti.
Thank you, Susan. And again, welcome to everyone, and thank you guys for taking time to participate or to listen to what we have to say today. And I just, as Susan mentioned, Our agency does provide free legal assistance to individuals with mental health disabilities. In addition to special education, we provide other things like fair housing information. And so we have a lot of materials on our website. We encourage you to, after this presentation, to check out what's available there. But as you know, today's presentation focuses on special education, specifically mental health services that are available in schools. So here's the overview of the webinar. And as you can see, it's divided into 4 sections. So the information in the first 3 sections is based on the kinds of questions that our agency gets from parents who are calling about issues that they're having with their children's IEPs. So we're going to spend the bulk of our time in that first section, mental health services available in schools. It is included in that section is going to be sort of a lot of the background of the law, and then the specific services that are available in schools for children who have mental health needs. And keep in mind, this is not children who have only mental health needs. It's children who, among other needs that they may have, also have mental health needs and would need to have those needs addressed in their IEPs. So the bulk of our time will be in that first section. And the last section, just to kind of let you know, the how to be an effective advocate, that section we will go through probably pretty quickly. It's very detailed and self-explanatory, and we really just wanted it to be something that folks can come back and refer to later. But I will anyway try to incorporate some of those tools within the earlier part of the presentation. So let's get started. So the first section, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking about the background of the law. So I know that most of, if not all of you, are familiar with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. And even though it's familiar to some of you, I want to make sure everyone has this background information. And so the goal of the IDEA is to make sure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education. That means that those children should be provided with special education and related services that are designed to meet their unique needs. And we'll go over in a little bit what special education means and what related services encompasses. And related services is really where the mental health services and services to address mental health needs and behavior needs would fall into line right there. So some initial key points are obviously free. Free does mean free. The services that are provided under the IDEA are at no cost to the parent or the student. The IEP document is meant to be the outcome of the meeting where the IEP team would meet and consider and discuss all the relevant information about the student's strengths, needs, their present level of performance, their baseline performance, and their goals. And so it is the individualized part. It's really crucial that the IEP is very individualized and focused on the students, because all students are different, all people are different. And so to make the IEP effective and services effective, you really want to be focusing on strengths and using the child's strengths to address their needs and make sure that the goals are challenging enough, but not too, not out of reach. And you want to, it's a very careful balance that needs to be done for each student with an individual, with an IEP. So that focus is really key, that it is a student-by-student approach. The education, the E in IEP, education is covering more than just academics. That's very clear from the law, the way that the regulations sort of indicate that even a child who has not failed a course or a grade and is advancing from grade to grade, even that student may need special education or related services because education encompasses other things. If you think about what we learn in school, it's not just not just the academics, the book learning that we do in class, but the socializing, interacting with peers, interacting with teachers. And you can also see it very clearly that education covers, the law means for education to cover more than academics in the assessments that are done to find out if students are eligible for special education. The assessments cover academics as just one piece. There's then social emotional and various other things, so that makes it very clear. Education is broader than just academics. Mm-hmm. And finally, the least restrictive environment principle is essentially there to make sure that children with disabilities, just simply by having disabilities, or students with disabilities, are not unnecessarily segregated from their peers who do not have disabilities, and that separation from them should really only happen when that's necessary and appropriate based on the child's needs and strengths. Okay, so the next point we want to make sure parents are aware of, and I'm sure advocates are aware that there are rights under this particular law. Two types of complaints I want to talk about are, or I just want to mention, are compliance complaints and due process complaints. So you can see there that for procedural violations, a person would file a compliance complaint. When I say procedural, I mean, how is the law supposed to work? So there are timelines and things like that. So if the school district is not following certain timelines that are required under the law, that would be a compliance complaint. Another type of procedural violation, it falls under a procedural violation, is if the school district fails in their child find duty. So there's this obligation that school districts have to identify and evaluate students who are suspected of having a disability or perhaps multiple disabilities that interfere with their education. And if they, when they identify those students, they need to evaluate those students in all areas of the suspected disability or disabilities. So that is another, how that relates to mental health disabilities is we have seen sort of instances where a child might, the school district would be on notice, could be on notice that the child might be having some significant mental health issues. There are instances where a child has been hospitalized, had psychiatric hospitalizations several times, and when we look at the IEP, that has, those the client has come to us and we're looking at the IEP, and there are no ERMs, educationally related mental health services, which I will talk about in a bit. When that's not there and the student has been experiencing psychiatric hospitalizations but does not seem to have any mental health services included in the IEP, obviously that IEP, or it's obvious to us anyway, that the IEP is missing a very critical piece. Because if the student is hospitalized and unable to come to school, that particular mental health disability is obviously interfering with that student's education. They can't access the education if they can't get to school because they're being hospitalized. So that is something that we have sometimes seen school districts, or parents come and say, well, they say that she or he is fine when they're at school. It's just, they're when they're hospitalized, obviously they're not at school, but every time that they're at school, they're fine. Well, they're on notice that there's a mental health piece that needs to be addressed, and so that would be a procedural violation, a compliance complaint issue. The other kind of issue is these substantive violations. Basically, what is the law supposed to accomplish? What's it's supposed to do? So if you're filing a due process complaint, typically you're making the claim that the school has denied your child the free, appropriate public education. So your child has been denied FAPE, and that could be that they have failed to develop an IEP that you feel is reasonably calculated to provide educational benefit to the student. That's sort of the legal phrase, but this typically happens if parents can't agree that the offer of FAPE that the school district is is proposing at the IEP. If the parent cannot agree on that, if the team cannot agree and the parent disagrees with the offer, typically that is the recourse that parents might have if subsequent IEP meetings can't resolve the disagreement. Okay, so there are links to those in the back on the resources page, so you guys can take a look at that. Links to those complaints. So the next kind of important point that I want to point out is the difference between IEPs and a 504 plan, and I'm sure many of you may be familiar with this as well. I just wanted to touch on some of the differences. You can see some right there. The main thing to think about or to see from this is that Section 504, it's from a federal act, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It's meant to be an anti-discrimination provision. So it's prohibiting discrimination based on disability. It's not just in the schools. It's not just applicable to schools, but in the school setting, what the focus is that the students with disabilities should have an equal opportunity to obtain the same benefit as their peers without disabilities. It also means that students with disabilities should not just get separate or distinct services or a distinct education unless that's necessary, you know, for example, in an IEP, unless that's necessary because of their unique needs. So there needs to be a reason why students with disabilities would be getting something different than their peers without disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Nishanti, so can you raise your voice just a hair?
Oh,
a little
sure.
bit louder.
Sure, yes. So then we can get to the next slide. So the next slide I just want to talk about, and actually just a couple slides, is about assessment and eligibility. And I know that, again, I know that many of you may be familiar with this process, but for those who do not yet have mental health services, assessments are actually really key for educationally related mental health services and also for developing a behavior plan. So for both of those things, you want to have assessments done. There are specific assessments that can be done to for the child so that they can see if those services are appropriate, educationally related mental health services, whether those would be appropriate, and for a functional behavioral assessment, which we'll talk about more in more detail, both of these things. But this is the same sort of process you would use that you use to get early on to have your child assessed for special education eligibility. So, you know, we always encourage people to do their assessments in writing, and this is a tip that's in the back of the back of the presentation about how to request assessments. So I won't go into too much detail here. Mm-hmm. But the assessment should be related to how either the behavior issue or the mental health issue is affecting the child's ability to access education at school. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. When you are requesting an ERMS assessment or a functional behavioral assessment, you are pointing to things that are affecting their education at school. And so when after the assessment is done and there's a proposed assessment plan, there will be an IEP meeting to discuss the results of the assessment. At the IEP meeting, there may be the results that say that the child does not qualify. If you disagree with that, the parents have a right to what's called an individual educational evaluation. And so you can request that another assessment be done to see whether your child qualifies, and it would be done by somebody who does not work for the school district, but who contracts with the school district to provide an additional assessment. That will extend the time. That assessment will also, the timeline for that will be 60 days as well. So keep that in mind. In the meantime, though, or not in the meantime, alternatively, if the assessments show that there are multiple categories, eligibility categories that the student might qualify under, be sure to include that all of those categories are listed in the IEP so that all of the needs can be addressed of the student. So we've listed here one category that we've seen with students who have significant mental health disabilities. Often they will fit this category, emotional disturbance. And if you see there, it includes, these children could be getting fine grades and just have these difficulties, these challenges here, inability to build relationships with peers and teachers. If children are unable to build friendships, these are sort of flags to find out whether there might be mental health needs that need to be addressed. And so it's important to make sure that all categories of eligibility are listed on the IEP so that all of those needs can be met. So as I said, we were going to just explain a little bit about special education and related services. So special education is specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of a child. You adapt the content or the delivery of the curriculum as needed for the child based on the student's disability. The related services is really where we're able to get at the types of services that are the non-academic focus. So as you can see there, a lot of psychological services, social work services, the mental health counseling, all of this falls under these related services. Additionally, transportation assisted technology, anything that's necessary for the student to be able to benefit from their special education, any services that would be necessary, those should be included so that the student can actually make use of the special education that they're entitled to. So now to get into more educationally related mental health services, which is also known as educationally related intensive counseling services. So some folks may have heard ERMS, others may have heard ERICS. It's the same. It's meant to be the same thing, and these may be appropriate, as we've been discussing, for folks who have behavioral, emotional, social, or mental health needs, and that these needs are interfering with their educational progress. So the thing about ERMS is that there are a wide variety of services that can come under this related service. So the student him or herself could get individual counseling by a licensed clinician. The parent or family can also receive counseling and also training for how to be able to basically for the parent to feel supported in being able to either implement strategies or tools to work with their child in the same way that those strategies might be used at school. So sometimes services that are being provided at school are effective, but because the child is only in school for part of the day, if the strategies being used there could be implemented at home and outside of the school, that could be helpful and beneficial to the student. The parent should be able to get training for that type of service so that they can, that the student can have a consistent approach throughout, and that would lead to better progress, or that would lead to a more effective plan and then progress for the student. As I mentioned, it does require an assessment, and that assessment needs, we recommend doing that in writing and indicating that the students, if it's peer relationships, if it's socially isolating themselves, whatever it might be, indicate that that's the reason for the educationally related mental health service assessment, and they will have somebody who's qualified to do that assessment. Do that assessment, and then in 60 days, meet at an IEP meeting to discuss the results of that, and figure out what would be appropriate. So the other type of thing that can be used is a behavior support plan or behavior intervention plan. This is something that can be. This also requires an assessment, and this assessment is very crucial to making the plan effective. So a functional behavioral assessment, what it's supposed to do is analyze why the behavior is happening, identify what the behavior is. Why is it happening? What's triggering the behavior? And then determine what strategies or what plan can be used to be able to have the negative behavior reduced and a positive replacement behavior used or implemented. So this, again, the same timelines apply that we've talked about with the assessments, but this behavior plan is a very key. You really want to make sure this is individualized to the student. Sometimes I've seen behavior plans that did not seem to have any kind of thoughtful functional behavioral assessment done. And there in the IEP, there's a behavior plan and there are behavior goals. And the goal would be that, for example, the student is doing XYZ negative behavior 10 times a week. And the annual goal is, 1 year from now, the student will reduce the number of times they do that negative behavior to 5 times a week. As a parent and the student, you need to ask, okay, how is this happening? How is that going to happen? Who is responsible for monitoring this? And who will I be talking to find out whether this strategy is working, so that we don't go one whole year relying on the student to just somehow know they're supposed to be doing something different. So sometimes having these things in place, that's one thing. The other thing is to make sure they're doing these things that you have in place are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Having a behavior plan that's not effective can be pretty damaging, because people are thinking something is happening. People are thinking, well, we're doing what we can. We've got a behavior plan in place. We have behavior goals. But exactly how is the child supposed to get support for those behaviors? And if the child is getting services outside of the school setting, for example, in the regional center, if there's behavioral therapy going on, is that person involved in the development of the behavior plan? If not, they should be. There should be a consistent approach. So those are the types of things, strategies to sort of be using, and these are sort of listed in the back as well: coordination of services, and making sure everybody who's involved in any way with the student can contribute the information that they have, the valuable information as to what works in the behavioral therapy, what was working, and to make sure those strategies are being used. And that information, you do not want that information to go to waste, especially when if it's effective, if what you have going on outside of the school is effective, you want to make sure that can get implemented and used in school. And so the behavior support plan, it really is meant to be individualized, and you want to make sure that you're getting a plan that's going to work for your child. Once you have that plan, obviously it's important to make sure anybody who's working with your child at the school knows how to implement that plan. Having a plan and having effective strategies is only going to work if the people who are going to be implementing the plan, who are going to be using the plan, know how to do it. So teachers and staff, they should really understand what their role is, and if they don't understand, they need to be supported. And they, sometimes that can be difficult for teachers to sort of say, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here. But we want to really make sure everybody who's involved in implementing any part of the IEP really understands and feels supported in knowing what their responsibility is. So that's very key to make sure everybody has a copy of that. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do. So we talked about procedural safeguards before. And we just reiterated here the types of complaints that you can file. Compliance complaint would be filed with the California Department of Education. The due process complaint is an administrative complaint. It would be filed with the Office of Administrative Hearings. I am talking about California, but I recognize that the folks in the other states, you will want to see. The links that I've got are California. Some of them are California specific or maybe most of them are, but you'll want to look at your State Department of Education website to figure out if there are any particular procedures to follow. So the next section is about who provides mental health services in schools, and we're talking about mental health services from the elementary school age up through high school when special education services are available. Most of you are familiar with the early intervention services that you could get through the regional center, from birth through the age of 3. And then there should be a transition for folks who need special education services in preschool and then beyond into elementary and high school. Sometimes what happens is that there are certain services that are covered by the regional center early on, and then the responsible provider changes to the school district once they enter into school. That doesn't mean that folks who are getting certain things like behavioral therapy and stuff like that from the regional center, you're still able to get some of those services. And in fact, I know parents whose behavioral have behavioral therapy sessions in the evening at home, and those individuals and those strategies are important and being used in the development of the IEP for that student. So when we're talking about mental health services in schools from elementary and forward, well, preschool and forward, but typically there aren't mental health services at that very young age in preschool. But there could be behavior plans and those types of things. Those are the responsibility is the local education agencies, which are typically school districts. And so that's just a clarifying point, but there's not a whole lot more to say about that. So for strategies for developing an IEP, we're really talking about what things you need to be looking at to make sure things are individualized for your student. So obviously it should account for the student's particular strengths and needs, and most IEP software programs that are developing the IEP in the meetings have a very set sort of thing of looking at what the eligibility is, what the present levels of performance, strengths, goals, those types of things. What's key is to not just kind of gloss over those things and make sure you're looking at, does this sound like my child? The strengths here, the needs that they have, and the goals. Like you want to be looking at that and making sure that these are really, you could identify this as your child and not just, some IEP. So that it's really important to make sure you're looking at those strengths and needs, because that should be informing the goals. And the goals should be very specific. I, mentioned about, behavior goals, just saying the student will do this bad thing less. That isn't really something that's helpful. If you're a teacher, do you know what you're supposed to do? If you're a parent, do you know how that's supposed to happen? If you're the student, do you know who's supposed to help you? So these are the things that you really want to make sure are spelled out and clarified in the IEP. And even if the IEP program doesn't allow for certain things, like perhaps some of them don't allow for multiple eligibility categories, or don't allow for varying off of the template that they have there. There should be an IEP note section that can indicate any sort of variance that you're trying to have to make sure that this is an individualized IEP document. And if there isn't space for that, add an addendum. Add something to the IEPs. You should always be bringing your own notebooks so that you can. These are notebooks that will have your information from from what you've observed, and then also notes that you can take at the IEP meeting so that you can make sure you understand what happened there, whether there were things that you disagreed with. This is always stuff that you want to make sure you're keeping a record of. But this is, this will help to kind of clarify individualized needs, and also if there's not a way to put it in the IEP document because the software doesn't have it, you need to be able to make sure your concerns are somewhere in there and attached to the IEP document. And you can do that. You can make these changes. It's unusual. People might think, well, I don't know if we're allowed to do that. You can say, of course, you can. So the main focus here on individualized. The next focus, the other focus is coordination of services. There may be services that an individual is getting through the county Department of Mental Health or the community services that provide mental health services. We have a lot of clients who do that, who have mental health services outside of the special education system. And it's important to make sure that those services are coordinated and compatible with each other. And it's important to make sure that the student's not being overloaded with, too many, counseling sessions in 1 week. That there is a balance to be had, and you have to make sure that each time, to keep in mind that the mental health services that are provided in school are during the school day. So it's going to be, removing the child out maybe once a week, maybe 30 minutes a week, maybe 60 minutes a week. So who knows? That can change depending on and it should change depending on the child's needs. But keep in mind that that's happening during the school day. So they may be missing instruction or missing, being part of the general education class while they're getting those services. And that's a balance. It has to happen during the school day, so that will need to happen. But if the child is also getting therapy, behavioral therapy in the evenings or other types of services outside of school, you want to make sure everybody's aware of how much time the child is receiving services and whether there's a point where that's maybe not helpful, maybe it's counterproductive or it's too much. That should be considered so that you're not overloading the child and they have time to be a child.
And we have about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Yeah, and so now, as we said, I really don't. This How to Be an Effective Advocate section is pretty self-explanatory. So we can go through it rather quickly. But obviously we say put things in writing. It's not that they're necessarily it's required by law, but it's helpful when you've got to keep things organized and you're trying to make sure timelines are being followed. So definitely do things in writing and also take notes of things. Time can go by and you might have a difficult time keeping track of the times you made requests for assessment or the times that you spoke with staff, and keeping a notebook of kind of different things that have been going on. It helps clarify for you when things have happened and how long it's been since a concern was addressed. And this is a helpful thing to do to be able to also prepare for potential complaints. If you're thinking of filing a compliance complaint or a due process complaint, they ask you for incidents. So, when did this happen? Who was involved? That type of thing. So keeping a log of things that you think are not going well will help you in the future if you end up needing it. Remember to be a participant at the IEP meetings. I'm sure many of you have, very familiar with going to these meetings, but sometimes parents can feel like they're not an equal sort of partner in this meeting, and of course they are instrumental and critical for getting the kind of information about the student that the school district doesn't necessarily have. The parent, you know your child the best, so your opinions, your thoughts, your concerns need to be heard, and you need to bring them to the table. Bring people with you who are already working with your child, who have something to contribute. We've mentioned it: regional center staff, support groups that you're with, peer support, family resource centers. Folks that you might be getting help from there. anybody, and really just anybody for support. You're allowed to take anybody to an IEP meeting to kind of help you maybe keep track of things too, take notes and process things so that you don't feel like you have to do it all alone when you're talking with a lot of professionals, educational professionals. That can be intimidating. Bring someone with you so it doesn't feel so. I hope that people know, and they've been told that if you need an interpreter, you should request one, and one should be provided to you, and it shouldn't be somebody who's doing another role, at the IEP meeting. It should just be somebody who's an interpreter, and that's all they're doing, so that they can. There's so much that goes on. That person's job is just there to interpret. We've talked about taking notes. We've talked about being a participant, which means ask questions. If you don't understand something, ask questions. If you don't know who is supposed to be in charge of what goals, ask who that is. If a goal was not met, ask why. If a goal is not met, it might be an indication that different services or more services are needed. So ask as many questions as you feel you need to. And if you feel like everything can't be done in the meeting, in the time allotted for the meeting, which usually is about an hour, people schedule IEPs for about that, school districts schedule them for about that much time. If you feel like you can't get to everything and you don't feel comfortable finalizing it right then and there, don't. Ask to continue it, reconvene and continue that IEP meeting in a few days, within the next week or something like that. So keep that in mind, that you shouldn't feel pressured into agreeing to something that you don't actually either understand yet or feel comfortable agreeing to yet. We've talked about being specific with goals, being specific with services and placement too. The specificity is really helpful in case your child transfers schools. The next school district should know what the child was getting. They may adopt that, or they may do a new assessment and then change things. But then you want to make sure everybody knew what the child was getting at any given time. Anybody should be able to identify that. Okay, so the right to disagree, those are the complaints, the due process complaint that we mentioned. And just there's some resources there. Our agency is at the top there for folks in California. And I'm sorry, these are all California specific, but hopefully this can be at least sort of a lead for folks in other states where you might be looking. Disability Rights California is California's protection and advocacy agency. Every state should have one. So for those in other states, I would encourage you to look up the Protection and Advocacy Agency in your state. They are typically really great resources for people with disabilities, and it's not just focused on special education. It is people with disabilities. They are there to enforce the rights and advance the rights of people with disabilities.
Okay.
So we'll end there.
Thank you, Nishanti. That was a lot of information.
It was, yes.
Really useful, I hope. So here's another quick question for all of you listening. Do you feel you now have a better understanding of mental health services in schools for students with disabilities? Please show your response by moving the temperature slider. It looks like favorable, yes. Okay, great. So I know you still have questions, so this is the time to ask them. Please click on the Ask a Question button in the top left corner of your screen and type away. It'll help us if you identify yourself as a parent, a person with a disability, or a professional. And we have a little under 10 minutes, so we'll get to as many as we can in the limited time we have. All right, so bear with me just a second as I start to go through the questions. Could you just clarify, because several people are asking again about the age range, does the school district cover services for children 3 years through 22? Yes. Yes,
okay. They do. So 3 through 22. Unless the student graduates with a high school diploma, that a student who graduates with a high school diploma will be exited out of special education. But otherwise, 3 through 22 is when the school district is
Got it.
the
Okay.
provider.
Let's see. I don't know if this is apparent, but it says you have said that ERMS services are provided by licensed staff. Can't ERMS services be provided by registered interns under the supervision of licensed staff?
So, actually, I don't know. I know that counseling services that are not, there are counseling services that are available that you don't have to go through ERMS and do an ERMS assessment. So I'm actually not sure if there's where that requirement might be, if it's under a federal requirement or the state requirement. So I'm sorry, actually I can't say for certain. But it could be that if there is supervising, I'd have to look into that to be really sure. I don't want to misspeak.
Okay. We have a parent who's also a professional asking for confirmation that there's a possible total of 75 days from parent request to the actual assessment. What is the timeline there?
Yes, so that's correct,
Okay.
because what will happen is you will have 15, so when the parent makes a request on day 1, the school district has 15 days to respond to that request. If they respond on the 15th day with a proposed assessment plan and the parent signs it that same day and gives it back to the school, signs the consent, that will start the 60-day timeline. So it's actually really important that once the proposed assessment plan is received by the parent, they sign, if they've checked and made sure that all the assessments that they want done are going to be done, sign the consent and give it back. The school districts cannot do the assessment without the consent of the parent. So yes, it could be, it should be at least, well, depending on whether the school district takes the full 15 days, it can be 75 days. It can be longer if the parent doesn't give the proposed assessment back.
Is that calendar days or?
Calendar days. It doesn't
calendar days.
Calendar days, but it does not include holiday breaks, school breaks that are over 5 days. So it won't include summer break, and then winter break.
Got it. Okay. We have someone asking, how are services that should also be available through a child's insurance, assuming they have it, or if available, reviewed in terms of what's available to address child's needs, I assume within the school?
Yeah, so the child should be, if a child is eligible for services through the school district, through special education, those services should be offered. The parent doesn't have to take them, the child doesn't have to take them. They can decline them if they prefer their services through their insurance. But having insurance and having services, having an insurance plan that would provide certain services does not relieve the school district of their obligation to provide those services in their offer of FAPE. So at the IEP they will offer those services. The parent can decline if they prefer services elsewhere, but they shouldn't be not offered simply because the child may have access to it in another way. So,
right.
So this won't. So family's income or family's resources, it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be considered here when deciding whether a student is eligible for certain services.
Okay. And the school district is supposed to address specifically like what's going on with the child at school too, right? And the private insurance person doesn't necessarily have access to the child's performance or behavior in school.
Right.
That makes sense? Yeah. Okay, so we have a parent asking, my son has ADHD. Does this count as a mental health disability? Because his school is telling me that is not considered a learning disability. His grades are bad and he's having difficulty in class.
So I would say, and sometimes, so ADHD typically falls under the eligibility category of other health impairment, OHI, and that I guess what I would do is, rather than focus on the name, on the name of the diagnosis, focus on the needs. So there are behavior issues, focus on that. Say, well, these are the problems that are happening. So what is going to be done to address those problems? You can call it what you like. You can label it what you like. The problems are there. You can't deny that, right? So that's the thing to focus on. Focus on what the needs are, what the problems are, and then ask what are we doing to help address these particular problems. If there are behavior problems, I would request a functional behavioral assessment so that you can get that started. And that will be one of the assessments that you'll request that in writing. They'll have 15 days to respond, and then once they give you that proposed plan, they'll have 60. After you sign the consent, they'll have 60 days. If there's any time that there's behavior issues, I would request that assessment. It's one that a lot of people don't seem to know about when they come to our agency. That's one to do. You don't need to have a specific mental health diagnosis. And I would really caution ever sort of thinking or buying into to somebody's justification that if they don't have a particular type of disability, they can't get a certain kind of service. You're looking at the need. We can call it whatever we want, but you're looking at the need. If the need is there and it's interfering with the education, they should get that service.
Okay. It sounds like a parent asking, when you live in a rural area and they don't have a provider such as she says speech therapist, but it could be any kind of therapist, what should the family do?
So they don't have a provider who's able to travel to the school. If they don't have a provider who's able, and I'm sorry, I was asking as if the person was going to respond. So so let me rephrase. So if that service is needed, if they need to have somebody travel in or somebody who's a contractor, they need to be able to figure out a way to address that need. So is there an online program? Is there some other way to be able to address that need? Because it's the cost issue. It might be a very expensive thing. That isn't a reason to not get it. If the child is eligible for those services, the speech services or whatever the services might be, the school district has an obligation to figure out how that child can get those services. And so I would reach out for those individuals. I would reach out to your protection and advocacy agencies to see if they can assist in educating the district about their responsibility there. If you're having difficulty which it seems like he or she might be, having difficulty in persuading the district that it is their obligation to find that, even if it's going to be more expensive than they would want,
Yeah. Okay. So parent and professionals asking, child was receiving counseling on site at school, but school ended counseling, stating it was only contracted for one school year. Child would benefit from additional counseling. Would the child still be eligible for this service regardless of whether private or county insurance is available?
Yes. So I'll answer the second one first. Yes. Even if the child is eligible for other services outside of the special education process, if they are requiring and need those counseling services, those should be included in the IEP. If there was I'm imagining that it was in the IEP, and so there should have been an IEP meeting that removed that service from the IEP. Those changes can't be made. Changes to the IEP document can't be made unless there's an IEP meeting held, and so it would be. So if that happened without there being a meeting held, that's a violation, and you can file a complaint for that. But you can also mention. I think sometimes before filing the complaint, you can mention to the school district, look, this was a violation of that, and rather than file the complaint, I'd like for you to just put the service back, and let's not waste the time when we know that this was a violation. If you think that you can make that happen without having to go through the complaint process, that might be ideal and save some time.
And if the school district just
says in the IEP he's no longer eligible, then the parent should not sign that IEP if they're in disagreement with that.
Right. And the parent can sign agreement to the other parts of the IEP,
yes,
and specifically say, I disagree with the school district's removing of that particular counseling service or whatever other service. So you can always disagree in part and agree in part. And the reason to agree with whatever you do agree with and make sure you sign the consent is so that they can continue or start those services while you work out the disagreement.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have one last question. We have like 2 minutes. So a parent is asking, if a child has an eligibility of autism and is currently receiving related services, can I still request an assessment for mental health, asking due to socialization and emotional regulation issues? We have been informed in the past that, sorry, can you scroll? I'm sorry, we have been informed in the past that they felt that their services would not be much use because they felt the child would not gain much due to the autism. The child is a fully verbal child.
Okay. Yes, I think you should still request the assessment. If you do that in writing, they should. So if they are not going to give you a proposed assessment plan back, they actually need to give you something in writing saying we're not going to assess because, and then say why they don't want to do it. Then you can say, okay, I disagree with you on that, and you can. This is where you would actually do, if you wanted to do a due process complaint, to say, I think the IEP doesn't have, it's not, the school district has failed to develop an adequate IEP, because for you, you're thinking the adequate IEP would be to include, potentially include these services. And I can't know for sure whether these services whether the child would benefit from these services because they're refusing to do an assessment. Even if the school says, hey, we don't think that the student would benefit from these, okay, do the assessment and let's find out. And if in the end the assessment, the results are that he may not qualify, then you have if you disagree with the assessment results, there's a different right there. We mentioned it. It's the independent educational evaluation. You can request that. But just when you have these, when you're doing a lot of the talking back and forth, you may not be able to get them to put down in writing, and maybe they wouldn't want to, and maybe then that would pressure them to do it, just so that you have that assessment done.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Nishanti, for the great discussion and information, and thanks to all of you attendees for your participation. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation and that you will join us again for our next webinar, which will be on February 23rd, and the topic will be housing for people with disabilities. And this concludes our meeting today. So as promised, we're finishing up this meeting to leave time, just a few minutes for you to fill out our evaluation survey. So please leave your browser open, and a short survey will appear on your screen when I close this meeting. The agency that enables us to bring these webinars to you requires that we do these surveys. So we really appreciate your feedback, and we do read all your responses and take them into account for the future. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Nishanti.
Thank you, guys.